Jesus says, "Come, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." You, friends, are invited. You are invited. Those are words that meant a lot to me, and they still do, but they meant a lot to me, especially when I was a bachelor. There were a considerable number of years before Sarah and I got married, and so as a bachelor, I often ate like a bachelor. Especially, I think of my vicar year. That's what's like your intern year for being a pastor, and so I spent that as a single man. And so pretty much my Thursday menu looked a lot like my Monday menu and my Tuesday menu and my Wednesday menu. It was pretty much eggs, spaghetti. Those are pretty much it. Maybe a little bit of mac and cheese every now and then, but it was pretty repetitive and not much else. And so I knew that I couldn't cook very well, and I made sure that other people knew that as well. And lo and behold, suddenly I would start to get some invitations to come and enjoy the food that they had made. And that meant a lot to me, especially as someone who got pretty bored with what I was usually eating. It wasn't very exciting. There's power in an invitation, not just in the food that's served to you, but also in the experience of being together with another family, being together at a table. There's power in an invitation. You are invited. That's the message that we hear today, that you and I are invited, but this invitation is to something so much more than, I guess, what would cure a bored bachelor's stomach. No, this invitation is to God's banquet. This invitation is God's banquet of blessings that he would serve up to us, where he promises us a joy and an excitement in our experience of life, no matter what it is that's behind us from the past week or what's ahead of us in the week ahead. In this banquet, he promises that he's going to serve up to us a peace that we can hold on to and that will hold on to us and carry us through whatever it is that we are facing. This banquet of blessings that God would give us is one in which he promises us the one and only way to find life, as Jesus says, that is life to the full. Life that will last no matter what it looks like in terms of how long your life will last, how short or how long it seems in terms of your earthly years. You are invited. As we think about that theme today, I think one of the key questions that I learned to ask when I was invited is, as a guest, if I wanted to be gracious, if I wanted to be grateful, I would often ask, well, what should I bring? Is there anything I can bring that would make your job as the host a little easier? I think that's one of the first questions we're going to ask that kind of helps us frame this parable and what's going on in it. As you do, I want to share with you, something that I ran across a few years ago. It was some details about a special celebration that took place back in 1971. It was held by the Shah of Iran. And this took place because this was celebrating the 2,500th anniversary of the Iranian monarchy. Not something that happens, every year, every day, right? 2,500 years of history. So they decided to do this really well and to do this right. And so the Shah invested $200 million. Now, this is 1971, so that'd be like $1.5 billion today, figuring in inflation. And so he did things like improving the airport and widening the highways to and from the airport out to where they're gonna have this celebration. He invested several $1 million in today's money in a set of tents, ornate tents for the guests to come and to stay in. A fleet of 250 Mercedes-Benz limos. They hired a French, Michelin star restaurant to shut down for 2 weeks to come down and to cater this place. It's that kind of party that we're talking. And so that meant that with that kind of lavish investment going into it, you couldn't just crash this party. You had to be somebody or to know somebody. You had to be a king or a queen, a president or a prime minister, a celebrity, or some sort of noble to get there. But let's say you did get invited. You asked that question, well, what do I bring? I think when you're talking this scale, when you're talking, this type of lavish banquet, I don't think you bring anything. Every detail's been accounted for. Everything is there and prepared. You just show up and you enjoy. I think if you stop at the gas station and pick up a 6-pack of Bud Light or Miller High Life and maybe a bag of Cheetos and show up with that, I think that's more insulting rather than ingratiating to the host who's prepared something like this, right? The point when you're celebrating like this is you show up and you enjoy. Now, I want you to think about that because Jesus talks to us today, and he says that the kingdom of heaven is like this king, kind of like that Shah, who prepares a wedding feast for his son, which would make him the prince, probably the heir to that entire kingdom. And he invites people to this wedding. Now, one of the things that you have to remember is that in those days, wedding feasts would last for several days, and the preparations would take quite a bit of time, and you didn't necessarily know when everything would be ready, because the worst thing that could happen to you was for you to invite people and then to run out of food or wine, and we know of one time where that happened to people, and Jesus helped them out. So they would make sure to go to all the painstaking details to get everything ready, send out an invitation first, and then once everything was ready to go, they'd send it out again. Now, if this is the wedding feast for a king's son, imagine the scale, the grandeur, the level of detail that's going into this. And you're invited. Notice he sends this out, and what are they supposed to bring? It just says they're invited to the banquet and tell them to come. You don't have to bring anything. Just come and enjoy the banquet prepared for you. As you look at this, and as you see Jesus speak to this, note that there's no mention of what you bring to the table. There's no mention of who comes and who doesn't come. Unlike the Shah's celebration, which obviously would only be for the who's who and the most powerful and important, there's no mention of that here. It just says those who were invited, they were invited to come. There was nobody who could not come. Only those that would not come. I think it's amazing to see that even after those people who refused to come, after they were originally invited, they responded, they said they would come. What does a king do? He sends those same servants back out to those same people. He demonstrates not only a lavish generosity in hosting this banquet and inviting them, but also this amazing patience with them. He sends them back to those same people again, and what does he say? What about my son's presents? How dare you? He could have. No, he says everything's ready. It's all here. It's all prepared. Just come and enjoy my feast. There's nobody who could not be there. Right? Even later we see that he invites even the bad and the good. Nobody who could not be there, only those who would not be there. He has them go out, come back, and yet the invited, they don't come. Did you see why they didn't come? Let's read that again. It says, they refused to come in verse 3, but then in verse 5 it says they paid no attention. They went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants and mistreated them and killed them. Really two reasons there. There was indifference and enmity, apathy and anger. You have some who just had better things to do. The one who had his property. And so, the king's invitation comes and he looks at it and shrugs his shoulders and says, I got better things to do. He's kind of bored with that invitation. On the other hand, you have somebody who goes to his business and he's got really important things to do, more important things to do, and so he's got to go to his business and take care of that. And the rest, well, they just resent the king altogether. And they kill his servants after they mistreated them. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like that. So what's his point? Well, the kingdom of heaven, again, like I mentioned, is not just the place of heaven, though the Bible does describe heaven itself and what it's like there as a wedding feast for the Lamb. But the kingdom of heaven throughout the Gospels is something that's not just then, it's also now. It is God's banquet of blessings, all those things that he has won and prepared for us right here and now already, though it will culminate then because of Jesus and what he's done on the cross and what he won for us by rising from the dead. This is the banquet of blessings that he's prepared for us, and the full forgiveness of sins and the sure hope of heaven. The fact that God is for us and not against us, and he promises that he's working all things for our good. The invitation to us to come and call upon him in every trouble. The assurance that he won't ever leave us or forsake us. It's those blessings and more, but all of them are tied to Jesus. And Jesus is saying here that God invites us, and he says, you feast on all these blessings. Just come and enjoy. There's nothing you need to bring, nothing that you can bring. But this parable also reminds us that there will always be those who resent God and resent his gospel, the good news of what Jesus has done for us. There will be people throughout the centuries and throughout history and still today that will hate that message and fight Christ's followers, and it doesn't take but more than a quick glance, especially on the internet, and you'll see places like Indonesia and places like the Middle East where Christians are killed because of their faith. Christians are persecuted because of their faith. I'm willing to venture, though, this guess, that no one of you has tried to kill a pastor before. I hope you keep that string alive, if that's true for you. I do. I'm willing to guess that none of you is bringing some lawsuit or fighting to make it so that God's word can't be preached in San Antonio. And I hope you keep that string alive too. But the question for us today is, does that mean that this parable then doesn't apply to us? I'm hoping that no one here is in that class of murderers. That was first referring to the Jewish people that Jesus went to that did kill God's prophets. And then they killed John the Baptist. And then they would one day kill Jesus himself, not too long after he spoke this parable. I'm guessing that that's probably not where we are, especially if you are here today. But remember, they weren't the only ones that missed out on this banquet. There was that group that just was bored or too busy with God's invitation. Not the murderers, but the ones who refused to go because they had some more important things to do. That happens to us when God's invitation to come and to gather here with God's people, you're here today, but when that goes unused, when that's neglected because, we've got so many other things to do. That happens when that invitation to find what God gives us in our Bible reading or in our family devotions, when that gets passed over. Because, we've got other things. That happens when God calls us to live in that identity that he has given us and to remind ourselves of that identity that he holds out to us and has provided us with in our baptism, to remind ourselves of that again and again, and yet all too often we don't even pay it a passing glance. Right? It's not just those that murdered the king's servants that missed out on the banquet. It's also those that just were too busy with life, with their hobbies, with their business, with their job, with their kids, with the soccer games, with whatever it might be. They were the ones that were on the outside looking in, but not because they weren't invited, not because they couldn't bring what the king would want them to in order to befit the invitation. No, it's just that they would not come. I think that's a really important thing for us to just step back and to recognize that all too often we neglect the invitation because we don't marvel at it. Jesus helps us kind of capture that a little bit more as he goes on. And in verses 8 and 9, what does he do? He recognizes, well, I can't have a banquet, the king does, and have nobody there, just like the kids reminded us before. You got to have people there. Then he said to his servants, the wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. And all that means is that they didn't trust him. They didn't accept that invitation. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find. So the servants went out into the streets and they gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good. And the wedding hall was filled with guests. They go out, and the street corners that's referred to here is probably not the street corners like we think of. Instead, it's probably the place where the roads outside, that would go outside of the cities, would go actually literally through the walls of the city. And this would be where you'd have all sorts of interesting people gathered there. You'd have businessmen, but you'd also have prostitutes and tax collectors, people who were rich, people who were poor, young, old, people who look good on the outside and those who definitely did not. But the king says, bring them all in. Bring them all in. This is not about who you are. This is not about what you bring. This is just about accepting that invitation and coming and enjoying what God has given you. We read, so the servants went out into the streets and the wedding hall was filled with guests. All these guests came simply because they were amazed that a king would invite them. I think maybe that's part of why we don't get so excited when it comes to what God invites us to experience here, what God has prepared for us, not only now, but for all eternity. Somebody has said, and I think said well, that if you're going to have a banquet, you really should invite beggars because they've got nothing else. And so when they come in, they're not going to be going, oh, I can't believe they paired that wine with that particular dish. That's not going to go well. No, they're just happy for anything served to them and for them. They're look at the size of that turkey. They're excited about every plate put before them. And think about what Jesus says to us. He says, blessed, happy, thrilled with excitement are those who are poor in spirit, those who are utterly bankrupt, those who are beggars, spiritually speaking. Because that's what we are. The surest way to not miss out on this invitation is to just remind ourselves of exactly who we are and who we aren't. That every blessing that we have is only by God's grace, and that what we deserve is nothing from God. We are sinful and we have fallen short of His glory. We should not be invited at all. We're not entitled to anything from God. And yet, as beggars, what does He do? He invites us. He invites us to come and to receive all of His blessings. What do we bring? As the hymn says, nothing in my hands I bring. Simply to thy cross I cling. All we do is we come and we rejoice because though we are beggars, He's invited us to the wedding feast of His Lamb now and forever. Though we have nothing to bring, nothing but our sin, and even our righteous acts are like filthy rags, He invites us to rejoice and bask in the banquet of His blessings, even here and now. Bask in that truth, that the one who made heaven and earth, the one who holds all time and the universe in His hands and your life, He's invited you to come to His banquet, to rejoice in all of His blessings. But there is another question that this parable also reminds us to ask when we're invited. Another important question to kind of think through. What do you wear, right? Because some parties, you really do need to know, if you're invited, what you're supposed to wear. Because you don't want to show up at a costume party not dressed in a costume, or vice versa, find out that this particular celebration is one that you're not supposed to wear a costume and you show up in a costume. Or on the other side, if it's one where you're supposed to dress up and you're not very dressed up, that's a big deal. Now, I'm told, though, and this type of party, I guess, is way beyond my pay grade, that there are some parties that are so lavish and so high class, I guess, if you will, that it doesn't just come with an invitation that says tux required or black tie only. There are some parties where they actually provide you with the clothes that you're supposed to wear, or with a special ticket that you take to a tuck shop, and they'll pick out that particular one, and it's already provided for you. It's paid for. I've never been to one like that, and maybe some of you have. But the point is, if you go to a party like that, that's not a place to let your originality shine. It's probably not one we're going to show up in shorts and a Hawaiian shirt going, hey, here I am. That's a slap in the host's face. Bear that in mind as you look at the final details of this parable, because they kind of seem really strange after I just said, everybody's supposed to come, the bad and the good. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you can bring. And then suddenly the king goes in, and what does he do? He points to the one who's not dressed appropriately, and he kicks him out. And in this picture, this is a picture of being thrown out into the outer darkness, which is a picture of hell. What's going on here? I thought anybody can come. Everybody can come. It's not about what you bring. Well, remember that kind of party. In verse 12, this is what we read. Friend, he asked, how did you get in here without wedding clothes? It says the man was speechless. We might immediately come to his side and go, well, wait a minute. That's not really fair to him. I mean, what if he couldn't afford the wedding clothes? Or what if he didn't have time, right? They were just invited to go back and get the wedding clothes. Okay, those are fair enough. But the key is, what did the man say? He was speechless. He offered no excuse because there was no excuse, and the only way that could happen, right, is if the wedding host, the king himself, provided the clothes that were needed, right? All of these people, I mean, they weren't expecting to go to the king's wedding feast for his son that day. They were out there, out by the city walls, doing their business. No way expecting to be invited to the king's son's wedding. They weren't ready. They weren't prepared. Nobody could afford these clothes, probably, but the king provided them, and that's why this man was speechless. And so what's the point here? Well, on the one hand, the first part of the parable, when it speaks to anybody and everyone being invited and nothing that we can bring, that reminds us that God's gospel call, what he calls us to in Jesus, that's all-inclusive. There is nobody who can say because of their socioeconomic status or their race or because of how young or old they are or how long they've been a Christian, how many times they've been in church. There's nobody who can say that they have not been invited. It is all-inclusive. And yet, the other part of this parable also reminds us that this gospel and this invitation to the banquet is unapologetically exclusive. That you don't get to be in this banquet unless you are clothed properly, and that is a picture of being clothed in holiness and righteousness. God is very clear. He says, be holy because I, the Lord, your God, am holy. He says, even our righteous acts are like filthy rags. But here's the key. The holiness we need is not a holiness we bring to the table. It's a holiness that comes from Jesus himself. That's the power of the gospel that we just heard about before. A righteousness that is by faith from first to last. A righteousness that comes because God made him who had no sin to be sin for us so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. As Romans 4 verse 5 says, it's to the one who does not work, try to bring something, but to the one who does not work, but trusts God who justifies the wicked, the ungodly. That faith is credited as righteousness. And it's in baptism where God either worked that faith for the first time or he strengthened that faith that we're told that all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. You have everything you need to be in that banquet clothed in Jesus. But apart from Jesus, we don't belong. Brothers and sisters, that's an amazing thing for us to really, I think, take home in our hearts. That we're invited, that we're included, that we belong there, not because of what we bring, but because of what God has already given us to wear in Jesus. But I want you to think about that as you go out into the world today, as you go in your neighborhood, into your workplace, when you look at your family members and you think about them, because there is no one there that you are looking at that has not been invited to this banquet, though they might not know that. As David and those kids reminded before, they need somebody to invite them, to remind them. Now you might say, well, but they know about God. Oh, they're nice and sincere. Well, we found out from this parable, though, that it's not being nice and sincere or just knowing about God in general that gets you into the banquet and keeps you there. It's faith in Jesus. And if they don't have that faith, the Bible is clear. They are on the outside looking in. Right? I get the impression that this man didn't think to himself, I really shouldn't belong here. He felt like he fit in just fine until it was too late. But know this, in those people in your life, it is not too late for them. And so love them, even when they're unlovable. Listen to them, care for them, but please let them know about Jesus. I just read the other day that it's about 7 out of 10 people that, Americans, I should say, that they'd be willing to listen to friends, especially a Christian friend's story, even if it talks about Jesus. They'd be happy to hear about that. They'd be intrigued to hear a little bit more about that. But they also said that about half of them said, though, that they have friends that are Christian that won't ever talk about it, though, or rarely, if ever. They also said that they would never think about it if it hadn't been for somebody who brings it up to them. I want that to be a challenge for you, especially as you go into the Christmas season where it's all the more likely that a person would accept an invitation, all the more likely that they would have a conversation. Now, why is it that your Christian faith is so important to you, and things like Christmas and taking time to really think about Jesus is so important to you? As we have that opportunity presented to us, will we be those, I guess first and foremost, that bask in the invitation that God has given to us? And dress ourselves, if you were, for where we're headed, to that banquet one day, and to let that light shine. But also, will we accept that invitation that he gives us to invite others, to tell others? Yeah, to do something that, I get it, it's risky. Even Jesus said not everybody listened to him. But because it matters that much. Because God invites us and them to come, bringing nothing in our hands, to come, and he's got everything ready for us to come. He's got the clothes ready to go. Christ and his righteousness, and only through faith in him. Amen.